Hey you guys, my name is Hazylle and welcome to my workshop with Strathmore. We're going to be exploring the human face in different mediums. We're going to let each medium shine and show its individuality in the different ways that we render the face. So for this first one, we're going to start by exploring the structures of the face and the features that make up the head before we can really start to render our sketch. I've always thought that it was a lot easier to draw when you know the very basic anatomy of the face first, and so this will help us later on render our portraits too. So let's start. Okay guys, so to start off with this first lesson, I'm gonna first introduce you to the art supplies that we're gonna be using. And the very first one, I think the most important one, is the paper, and this one is the Strathmore 400 series drawing pad. This one is in the medium surface, which is exactly the one that I prefer. I like this one for shading and sketching, especially because I prefer to use slightly softer pencils, and I think those ones are just perfect for the tools on this paper. And we're going to be using an eraser too, and for this one, Lyra Orlow-Techno eraser, and it's a very classic eraser, and we're just going to use it to take out any mistakes if we do end up making them. And for the pencils that we're going to be using, we're going to be using a whole set. This one is the Lyra Rembrandt drawing pencils. This set is great because it has different hardness and darkness levels. The pencils marked H are the pencils with the harder lead, so these are great for cleaner lines. The higher the numbers are on there, that means the harder the lead is too. These kinds of pencils are best to keep your lines clean, and I found them to be great for technical drawings too. Meanwhile, the pencils that are marked B are a lot softer, but I also can go darker in values. These I think are great for shading and getting in those darker values on our sketches, which we'll need later on when we start shading our sketch especially. But for today, I'm just going to be using one of them, and that is the 2B pencil. This one is on the harder range of the B level pencils, but it's still soft enough for my sketches to feel natural, and especially for drawing portraits when I like to do softer lines. I usually would go for a softer pencil even for my initial sketch, so this is what I'm going with for me. As you start to draw more, you'll get a better feel for the comfort level in the pencils that you use, so it's kind of great to start with a set like this to get a proper gauge of the kinds of pencils that you would be more comfortable with. So now that we have our art supplies in hand, we're now going to start with the structures of the face and the head. And always to start with, I start with a sphere, and this would represent the top part of the skull, so it's very round. Once we have that, another thing that we'll need to remember is that the side of the sphere is a little bit more flat. How we're going to represent that is we're just going to draw another circle beside it. We just really need to remember the angle that we're looking at this circle from. So since we're looking at it 3/4 of the way from the side, it's kind of how we'll see the flat circle too. And then we're just going to draw a cross right at the center that reminds us that this is a flat surface. So from there, we'll have a good basis of what the top of the head looks like. Now we're going to start with the rest of the face. And for that, we're going to start with the very center line of the face. And again, while we're drawing this, keep in mind the angle that we're looking at the face from. So right here on the side, and it should slightly curve in the way that the circle is too. And the length of this should be about half of this initial sphere that we have. And once that's on there, we're just going to slightly connect these lines. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. But right here, towards the very center of this flat side of the head, it's a very convenient nook to put in our ear. And we're just going to connect that part of the jaw to the chin too. So just make sure that the angle of the jaw follows what we see on the reference photo. And then what we're going to do is place our mouth line, and for that we're just going to make sure it's about halfway down from where the circle ends to where the chin is. But the nose should be very clearly in line with the bottom of the ear, or it's just the bottom of that main circle we have. But for now, the very shape of it is just a very triangular shape that we're just gonna hold as a placeholder for now, while we make sure there's room for the rest of the face. So what I'm drawing right here is what I call the eye mask, and what we're doing here is just making sure we're following the angle of the eyebrows, and this will still be somewhat following the main line that cuts across that first sphere, and then just roughly draws in the rest of the mask that will go around the eyes too. So once that's done, it's a good place to put in the eyeball, and I always like to draw the eyeballs. Instead of focusing on the very details of the eyes, I like it to have its own place in the face, and the best way to do that is to just draw them as eyeballs first before we draw in the details of the eyes. And then again, we have to make sure that there's space for the chin under the lips, and do the same thing for the space beneath her nose and her lip. And then we're also going to use the placement of the eyes to figure out how wide her lips should be, and for here it should be around the center of her eyeball, so that's how wide we're gonna draw ours. But once that's there, we're just gonna roughly draw in her neck. Because she's looking at us from behind her, you can kind of see the grooves of her neck right here. We just want to make sure that her shoulders and the back of her neck are following that same angle. For this part, it's kind of hard to see because it's hidden by her hair, but that's fine. We just need to have it roughly follow where we think that shoulder should end. So now we have a mannequin for the face and the head, and now what we need to do is mold it to look like the reference photo, and we're starting from the contours of her profile. We're making sure that her brow bone is curved in the same way as the photo, and we're doing the same thing to her cheekbones. Just make sure that the apex of the curves are in the same way, and everything else should follow very naturally. For her ear, I think it was just a little bit too close to her head, so I'm just gonna lightly erase that and change the angle to fit the model more. So right here, I'm just gonna draw in the contours of the ear too while we're there. And then the next thing we're gonna do is make sure that the hairline is following, again, the photo. Should still be able to see the top of the head for most hairlines, and again, it's not the same for everyone. And while we're there too, it's important to keep in mind where her hair is parted, because when we're drawing the rest of it in, it's going to be vital to figuring out where the strands are growing from. So might want to draw that in as well, and have the rest of the hair sitting on top of her head, and the volume should depend on how thick you think the hair is on the photo. So that's how I'm drawing her as well. So now that we have a place for everything, what we're now going to do again is make sure that her features match what we see in the photo. So for her, I'd like to start with her nose, and I think that the very tip of her nose is very prominent and important. So what I'm going to do is make sure I get that tip right. It's almost square-ish, the very center, and I just want to make sure that it has the right place in my drawing, and then draw in the nostrils underneath that. I do think that maybe I need to reshape the actual tip of it, so I'm just gonna lightly erase that and make sure it's just the tiniest bit pointier than I had it before. Before I go in with the nostrils, make sure that it's wide enough for her face. And you see right here, I'm using her eyes as the reference point to see how wide her nose should go. And the bridge of her nose, I think it's very straight. There's just a slight curve from where the tip starts, but then it should go in towards the curve of the eyebrow in a very expected way. So I think her lips are very prominent, so I really want to get hers right. And the most important thing is to get her Cupid's bow, I think. So that's where I start. Then we're going to do is curve it in from the sides, and the same for the bottom lip. Before we start to draw the actual mouth line, make sure that the rest is curved in the right way. I actually don't like to outline the lips so much when I'm sketching because I like to shade it in more than outline it. So we're just going to leave it like that for now while we draw in the eyebrows. And we want to make sure that it's framing the eyes in the right way and in a very similar way to the photo. Eyebrows are very different across different people, so when we're drawing a particular person, it's important to look at how the individual eyebrow is framing the face. So for the second one, I'm going to make sure that it's parted in the right way with reference to where the nose ends. So right here is around a good place to start. And I can draw the rest while keeping the framing of the eyes in mind. So now what we're gonna do is start to draw the shape of her eyes, and you'll see right now how much easier it is because we drew in those eyeballs first. It's now a lot easier to imagine the skin that's draped around that eyeball, and it's also a lot easier to keep our eyes uniform. But again, the eyes change a lot depending on the expression and across different people, so you still want to make sure that for this you're keeping very close attention to the reference photo. But having the eyeballs done first is a good way to have a reference point to where it starts and to just imagine how those eyelids and those eye bags will frame around the sphere behind it that is the eyeball. So for this right eye right here, you can kind of see her tear ducts, so it's a lot pointier, and we're also looking more at it from the side. So again, the curve is a little bit different from the one on the left, just because we're looking at it from a different angle. But just make sure while we're drawing the irises that we're keeping in mind how much of the whites of the eyes are left, rather than trying to see how big the irises are on her eyes. I just think it's a lot easier to look at the whites of the eyes more than the irises themselves. And then as I'm drawing the upper eyelid on this one is when I really saw that her eyebrow is a lot lower than it should be, because there's not enough space from the fold of her eyelid to her eyebrow. So I'm just going to use my eraser to correct that, and then with that blank slate I'm just going to draw that eyebrow again. So now we're going to start with the hair, and while we're roughly drawing in the hair strands, I always like to start where they are the darkest, and as I draw them farther out from that darker value, I just slowly start to lift my pencil so we get this nice gradient in shading when we draw in our hair strands. But again, the key here more than that is to make sure that we're following the hair strands in groups and we're keeping in mind where they are going from her scalp. So when we're going down, we want to make sure first that we're grouping them in the right way before we start to focus on what these individual hair strands will look like. So especially right here towards the back, I'm making sure that they're just flowing in the way that is similar to the photo. And especially here towards the top of the head, I want to make sure that it's framing the head in the same way as in the photo. So now that we're done with that, we're now going to polish up the details of the sketch. So I'm zooming you guys in on this one, and then we're going to start from the eyes. We're going to first make sure that her eyelashes are framing her eyes in the right way and make sure it's a little bit darker than before. And then we'll draw in her pupils, which actually centers the eyes really well, so I always like to draw in the pupils. And we're just going to darken up some of the edges more. Right here for her, I'm actually just darkening up her lower lash before darkening up some of her irises. Not too much, just enough to get a separation between that and the whites of her eyes. And do the same thing for the fold of her upper eyelid. And we're just gonna basically do the same thing to this right eye. And since I'm using a 2B pencil for this, it's a little bit softer. It's kind of nice to be able to add just the tiniest amount of pressure to it and still get the differences in values. So as I'm finalizing these lines, you can really see these lines more than the very first ones. Just making sure that all of the details are right. And for her mouth line, just gonna slightly raise that up like we did for her eyebrows. And then what I'm doing is doing some very light shading just to make sure that I'm getting the shape of them right. Because I really like to shade lips more than outline them. And then after that, we will be done with the sketch and this will be ready for us to do the shading. I hope you guys enjoyed this part of the lesson and I will see you guys for the next one when we start to render this with the rest of the pencils in our set.